Pearl Lockhart heard the words from across the general store, and they hit her like a fist to the sternum. "He has been asking about you since the day you arrived." She turned slowly, her fingers still curled around the bolt of blue calico she had been examining, and she stared at Edna Prout, the postmistress of Harlow Creek, Texas, who stood there with her hands folded at her waist and her eyes full of something that looked dangerously like pity. "I beg your pardon," Pearl said, her voice entirely too calm for the storm crashing through her chest. Edna stepped closer, lowering her voice as though the flour sacks and pickle barrels around them might repeat what she said. "James McCrae, the man who owns the Broken Spur Ranch. He rode into town the very afternoon your stage arrived, and he went directly to Clarence Holt and asked who you were, where you came from, and how long you were planning to stay." Edna paused. "That was 6 weeks ago, Pearl. 6 weeks of that man asking questions about you, and not one soul thought to tell you." Pearl set the calico down with great care. Her hands were not shaking, and she was proud of that because everything else inside her had come completely unmoored. 6 weeks. She had been in Harlow Creek for 6 weeks, teaching arithmetic and reading to the children of ranchers and miners in the one-room schoolhouse on Birch Street, trying to build something quiet and steady and safe out of the rubble of everything she had left behind in Galveston. She had told herself she was invisible here. She had told herself that was exactly what she needed. And the whole time, James McCrae had been asking questions. The name was not a stranger to her ears. She had heard it plenty. You could not live in Harlow Creek for 6 weeks without hearing James McCrae's name at least once a day. He ran the largest cattle operation in a 3-county stretch. He was the man every family farmer quietly hoped would not buy up their water rights. He was the man the town council deferred to, the man whose opinion on whether to build a second bridge over the Raker River actually mattered. He was, by all accounts, 40% legend and 60% something nobody could quite pin down. She had never spoken to him. She had seen him twice, from a distance, which was enough distance to register that he was tall, broad-shouldered, and rode a black horse with the kind of easy authority that made Pearl's stomach do something she strongly disapproved of. Both times she had looked away quickly, because she had not come to Texas to feel anything for anyone. She had come here to survive. But now Edna Prout was standing in the middle of Calloway's general store on a Tuesday morning in October of 1882, telling her that James McCrae had been conducting what sounded very much like a quiet, relentless investigation into Pearl Lockhart since the moment she set foot in his town. And no one had told her. The betrayal of that, the small, stinging betrayal of all these people who had smiled at her and handed her school books and invited her to Sunday supper, landed in her chest like a coal burning through cloth. She picked up her basket. "Thank you, Edna," she said, in the voice she used when she was absolutely not grateful, and she walked out into the October sunlight. The street outside was the usual Tuesday morning version of itself. 2 horses tied at the rail outside the saloon, Horace Denny sweeping sawdust off the barber shop steps, a wagon loaded with hay moving slowly toward the feed yard. Everything was ordinary and unhurried and completely unaware that Pearl's understanding of the last 6 weeks of her life had just been rearranged entirely. She stood on the boardwalk and breathed. She needed to think clearly. She needed to understand what it meant. A man like James McCrae asking questions about a schoolteacher who had arrived on the eastbound stage with 1 trunk and a recommendation letter from the school board in Galveston. That was not innocent curiosity. Men like James McCrae did not conduct idle inquiries. Every person in this town operated inside some web of obligation or ambition that connected back to the Broken Spur. And if James McCrae was interested in Pearl Lockhart, it was because she represented something he wanted, or something he feared, or something he intended to use. She had been used before. That was the dark past she had carried all the way from Galveston, packed in alongside her good dress and her father's Bible, the memory of a man who had seen her not as a person, but as a means to an end, who had arranged her life around his own advantage, until the arrangement shattered in a courtroom, and Pearl had walked out of that city with nothing but her dignity and a burning need to be somewhere no one knew her name. And now James McCrae knew her name. She turned left on the boardwalk and walked toward the schoolhouse, telling herself she was going to do exactly nothing about any of this. She was going to teach division to 10 children this morning. She was going to eat her noon meal alone on the schoolhouse steps the way she always did, and she was not going to think about James McCrae. She managed that plan for approximately 45 minutes. She was in the middle of writing long division problems on the slate board when the door to the schoolhouse opened behind her, and she heard the particular sound of boots on a wooden floor that did not belong to any of her students. Too heavy, too slow, too deliberate. She turned around. James McCrae was standing in the doorway of her schoolhouse with his hat in his hands. He was more immediate in person than he had any right to be. The distance she had observed him from before had softened him into something manageable. Up close, he was broad and sun-dark and somewhere in his early 30s, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red Texas limestone that jutted out of the hills south of town, and eyes that were the exact gray-green of a sky about to do something violent. He was looking at her with an expression that contained several things at once: a careful watchfulness, a restraint that seemed practiced and slightly effortful, and beneath both of those, something she could not immediately name. "Mr. McCrae," she said, because she was not going to let him have the first word in this room. He looked slightly surprised that she knew who he was. "Miss Lockhart," he said, "I apologize for the interruption. I was hoping I might speak with you if you could spare the time after your students are done for the day." Every child in the room had turned around in their seats and was staring at him with the completely undisguised fascination of youth. "I have a preparatory task this afternoon," Pearl said. It was not entirely untrue. She always had preparatory tasks. "Perhaps another time." Something moved across his expression, not quite frustration, but the controlled cousin of it. "Of course," he said. "I'll let you get back to your lesson." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he nodded, set his hat back on his head, and walked out. The children immediately erupted in whispers, which Pearl silenced with a look. But her heart was knocking against her ribs in a way she found profoundly inconvenient, because she had just looked directly into James McCrae's eyes for the first time, and what she had seen there, underneath the watchfulness and the restraint, was unmistakably and terrifyingly sincere. That frightened her more than anything else he might have been. She went home to the small room she rented from Alma Briggs on Cottonwood Lane, and she sat at her table with a cup of coffee that went cold while she tried to reason herself out of the corner she was in. The facts, as she understood them, were these. James McCrae had been asking about her for 6 weeks. He had not approached her until today. He had come to her schoolhouse, hat in hand, requesting a conversation. He had left without argument when she declined. She ran every one of those facts through the filter of everything she knew about men who wanted things from women, and she kept arriving at the same uncomfortable result. Either he was very, very good at appearing harmless, or he actually was something close to harmless. Neither possibility gave her any peace. She slept poorly, and the next morning she found a small bunch of wild asters on the schoolhouse step with no note attached. The morning after that, there was a jar of honey from someone's hives. The morning after that, a length of good beeswax candle. None of it carried a name. None of it demanded anything. Pearl stood holding the candle on the third morning and felt something she had not expected to feel, not suspicion, exactly, but its more complicated neighbor, which was the slow, terrifying dissolution of suspicion in the face of evidence that did not support it. She asked Alma Briggs about James McCrae over supper that night. Alma was 52 years old, had been widowed twice, and had opinions about everything in Harlow Creek that she shared freely and accurately. "James McCrae," Alma said, passing the bread, "is a man who got handed a great deal of trouble early in life and figured out how to carry it without letting it make him mean. His father died when he was 19 and left him with the ranch and a pile of debt that would have broken most men. He worked it off in 4 years, turned the broken spur into what it is now, and has not, in my observation, done a single dishonest thing in the process. He never married, Pearl asked, trying to sound casual about it. Alma gave her a look that suggested casual had not been achieved. He was engaged once, about 5 years ago. Girl named Clara Whitfield. She decided she preferred a lawyer from Fort Worth, and she left 6 weeks before the wedding. Town felt sorry for him. He didn't seem to want anyone's sorrow, though. He just went back to working his ranch. Alma cut herself a piece of bread. Why do you ask? He came to the schoolhouse, Pearl said. I know, Alma said, without the slightest indication that this was news to her. Pearl looked up. You know. Pearl, honey, this is a town of 400 people. James McCrae walking into the schoolhouse with his hat in his hands was the most interesting thing to happen since the Raker flooded back in June. Alma looked at her steadily. He's a good man. I know you have reasons to be careful, and I'm not telling you not to be careful. I'm just telling you what I know of him. Pearl thought about that for a long time after she went to bed. The following afternoon, a Friday, when her students left at 2 o'clock, she was sitting on the schoolhouse steps grading arithmetic papers when she heard a horse approaching at a slow, unhurried walk. She did not look up immediately. She kept her eyes on the paper in front of her, where young Tommy Holt had incorrectly divided 42 by 6 and arrived at 8 with an optimism she found almost endearing. The horse stopped. She looked up. James McCrae sat on his black horse at the edge of the schoolhouse yard, not pushing forward, not dismounting, just sitting there with the reins loose in his hands and his hat brim casting a shadow across his face. He looked at her for a moment and then said, I won't keep interrupting your workday, Miss Lockhart. I just wanted to say that whatever you've heard about my asking after you, I hope you'll let me explain it myself rather than take someone else's accounting of it. Pearl set down Tommy Holt's arithmetic paper. What is there to explain? He was quiet for a moment. There's a difference between the facts of a thing and the reason behind it, he said. The facts are that I asked. The reason is mine to tell you if you'll let me, and if I don't choose to let you. Something in his expression shifted, a careful acknowledgement of the possibility that she would not, that she had every right not to, and that he would survive that outcome, however much it cost him. Then I'll stop leaving things on your step, he said quietly, and I'll leave you to your peace. Pearl looked at him for a long time. The October afternoon was warm and still, the kind of afternoon that feels like the last good one before the cold comes in, and the light was hitting the dust in the schoolyard at an angle that turned everything amber and soft. Get down off your horse, Mr. McCrae, she said. There's a bench on the other side of that door. She heard him exhale slowly as he swung down, and the sound of it, that carefully controlled exhale of relief, cracked something loose in the wall she had been building since she stepped off the stage in Harlow Creek 6 weeks ago. They sat on the bench in the shade of the schoolhouse eave, and he told her. He did not circle around it or dress it up or make it sound like something other than what it was. He said he had been in Harlow Creek the afternoon the stage arrived, picking up a shipment of fence wire from the depot, and he had seen her step down from the coach. He said he did not know anything about her, not her name or her reason for being there, and he had told himself that was the end of it, a woman stepping off a stage, none of his business. He had driven home. But 3 days later, when he came back into town and someone mentioned the new schoolteacher's name and he asked one question, just one, it had opened something up in him that he had not been able to close. One question, Pearl said carefully. And then 5 more and 10 more and 6 weeks of asking. He looked at her directly. Yes, that reads like an obsession, Mr. McCrae. I know how it reads, he said. I'm not going to argue with you about that. All I can tell you is that I wasn't asking for purposes that should alarm you. I wanted to know whether you were safe here, whether you had what you needed, whether there was anything in your situation that was, he paused, choosing the word with evident care, precarious. Pearl stared at him. You were asking about me because you were worried about my welfare. I was asking because from the moment I saw you step off that stage, I felt responsible for your welfare," he said. "Which I understand is completely irrational given that we had never spoken, and I had no claim of any kind on your safety or your comfort. But there it is." Pearl Lockhart had been spoken to by men who were charming, men who were strategic, men who used words like weapons or tools. She was very good at identifying which category a given speech fell into. She sat with James McCrae's words and turned them over carefully, looking for the angle, the hidden motive, the trap concealed inside the sincerity, and she could not find one. That made it the most dangerous thing anyone had said to her in years. "I came here from Galveston," she said slowly, as though she were thinking out loud. I was in a situation there that required me to leave. A man I trusted used what I told him in confidence to serve his own interests, and when the consequences of that came down, they came down on me." She paused. "I am not inclined to trust easily." "That's a reasonable way to be," James said. "Most men would argue with me about it." "I'm not most men," he said simply. They sat in silence for a while after that, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. The afternoon light moved slowly across the schoolyard, and a mockingbird in the mesquite tree at the fence line went through its full repertoire, and Pearl became gradually aware that she was sitting close enough to James McCrae to be aware of his warmth beside her, and that she did not want to move away from it. "What do you want from me, Mr. McCrae?" she asked. "To know you," he said. "That's all. To have the right to talk to you without it being a surprise to everyone, including yourself." That is a very modest answer for a man who has been conducting an investigation for 6 weeks. A corner of his mouth lifted. It was the first suggestion of a smile she had seen from him, and it did something to the architecture of his face that she was not prepared for. "I'm aware of the irony," he said. Pearl looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about what it would mean to let this happen, to stop bracing, and just let it move the way it seemed to want to move. She thought about Galveston and the courtroom and the cold walk out of that building into a city that had already decided who she was. She thought about the fact that she was 28 years old and had not allowed herself to want anything tender or uncertain since she was 25, because wanting things that were tender and uncertain had cost her everything. She also thought about the asters on the schoolhouse step and the honey and the beeswax candle, and the fact that not one of those things had asked anything of her. "I take a walk along the Raker on Saturday mornings," she said, in a voice that was very carefully not making a promise. "There is a path from the South Bridge to the Cottonwood Grove. It takes about an hour, and I go at 8 o'clock. He was completely still for a moment. Then he said, "I know that path." "I'm sure you do," Pearl said. "It's a public path." She picked up Tommy Holt's arithmetic paper and went back inside. She did not sleep well that Friday night either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than the one she had been managing for the past 3 years. This one had a quality to it that was less like dread and more like standing at the edge of a high place and knowing you were going to jump and not yet knowing whether you would fall or fly. He was there when she reached the South Bridge at 8 o'clock on Saturday morning. He had not brought a horse. He was standing at the edge of the path in his work coat with his hat in his hands again, and when he saw her coming, he put the hat on his head and waited, and the simple restraint of waiting, of not walking toward her, of letting her come to him at her own pace, was the thing that finally, irrevocably began to undo her. They walked for an hour and talked the way she had almost forgotten people could talk, directly, without performance, about real things. He told her about his father's death and the years of debt, and what it had felt like to work a ranch that was failing and refused to let it fail. She told him a small piece of what had happened in Galveston, not all of it, just the shape of it, the man she had trusted, the secrets he had leveraged, the price she had paid. James listened without trying to fix it or minimize it or redirect the conversation toward himself. And that, too, was an unexpected thing to experience. He talked about his land with a love that was palpable and uncomplicated. The Broken Spur was 12,000 acres of Texas hill country, and he knew every water source, every rocky draw, every stretch of grazing grass on it. He talked about the creek that ran along the eastern edge and the way it caught the morning light in summer, and Pearl listened and could see it as clearly as if she were standing there. At the cottonwood grove they stopped, and the light came through the yellowing leaves in pieces, and Pearl looked at him and said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I expected someone with hidden motives." "I have motives," he said. "They're just not hidden." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes. "I want to walk with you again next Saturday if you'll let me." She let him, and the Saturday after that, and the one after that. November came in cold and fast, the way it did in the Texas hills, and the walks along the Raker became walks to the bakery on Main Street, where Mrs. Calloway kept a table by the window, and then suppers at Alma Briggs's boarding house on Sunday evenings, because Alma's cooking was the best in town, and she had made it quietly but unmistakably clear that both Pearl and James were welcome at her table. The town noticed, of course. A town of 400 people always noticed everything, and the fact that James McCrae was spending time with the schoolteacher who had arrived on the October stage was discussed thoroughly at every gathering and counter and fence line in Harlow Creek. Pearl was aware of being observed, and she braced herself for the specific discomfort of public speculation, which she had experienced in Galveston in its worst possible form. But this was not Galveston. The observation here was warm rather than predatory. People nodded at her with approval, smiled with something that looked like genuine pleasure in the development. Edna Pruitt, who had started this entire situation by telling Pearl the truth in the general store, stopped her one morning and said, "He is a good man, Pearl. Everybody here knows it. He just needed someone worth being good for." Pearl thought about that in the way she thought about most things James said or anything said about James carefully, repeatedly, and with a persistent awareness that she was trying very hard not to let it mean too much, and failing. What she felt for him was accumulating in spite of her best efforts to manage it carefully. It was not a dramatic, sudden feeling, which she had been prepared to defend against. It was something that built the way good furniture is built, quietly, carefully, with attention to all the joints that had to hold under weight. She liked the way he thought. She liked the way he treated everyone he encountered, from the ranchers whose water rights he managed to the Mexican vaqueros who worked his cattle, and whom he paid fairly, which was not common practice, and which he did not talk about unless someone asked. She liked the way he asked her questions about books she had read, and then actually thought about her answers before he responded to them. She also liked the way he looked at her, and she was less at peace with that particular piece of information than with any of the others. On a cold Sunday in December, 6 weeks after their first walk along the Raker, they were sitting in Alma's parlor after supper while Alma pretended to embroider in the corner and actually listened to everything they said, and James told Pearl about Clara Whitfield. He told it plainly, the way he told everything, the engagement, the planning, the 6 weeks before the wedding when he had started to see, without acknowledging it clearly to himself, that Clara was not happy and had not been for a long time. He said he had told himself it was pre-wedding anxiety. He said the truth was he had not wanted to see it because he had invested so much in the idea of being done, of having settled the question of his own life and future, that the evidence of the problem was something he kept setting aside. "And then she left," Pearl said. "And then she left," he agreed. "And I was angry for a while, and then I was sad, and then I was honest with myself, which I should have been a year earlier." He looked at the fire. "She made the right choice." "The wrong way and too late, but the right choice." "What do you mean, the right choice?" He turned to look at her. "I mean that I cared about Clara, but I was not in love with her. I was in love with the idea of not being alone. That's not a reason to get married. She knew it, even if I didn't let myself." Pearl was quiet for a moment. "That's a remarkably honest thing to say about yourself." "Honesty is the only thing I'm consistent about," he said. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing hard out of the north, and Alma had added wood to the fire until it was blazing with the particular warmth of a house that is sealed against weather, and the whole parlor had gone amber and close and intimate in a way that Pearl was very aware of. She said, without planning to say it, "The man in Galveston. His name was Edward Harmon. He was a banker. He courted me for 2 years, and I told him private things about my family's finances, about a debt my father had left because I trusted him. And he used that information to acquire a piece of property that should have been my inheritance. And when I challenged him legally, the town took his side, because he was Edward Harmon and I was just Pearl Lockhart, and the judge was a friend of his father's." She paused. "I left because staying would have meant spending my life as a cautionary tale about a foolish girl who trusted a man with her secrets." James had gone very still. He was looking at her with an expression that contained something she was becoming able to read now: contained outrage, the kind of anger that is felt on someone else's behalf and controlled out of respect for that person's need to tell their own story without being interrupted by your reaction to it. "I'm sorry," he said. "It wasn't your fault." "No," he said. "But I'm sorry it happened to you, and I'm sorry it made you have to rebuild your life, and I'm sorry it made you doubt yourself, which I suspect it did." She looked at him quickly. "What makes you say that?" "Because you're the smartest person I've talked to in years," he said, "and you still apologize when you state an opinion as though you're waiting to be corrected." Pearl felt the accuracy of that like a hand pressing on a bruise. She looked back at the fire. "Yes," she said very quietly. "It did that." "Well," James said, "for what it's worth, which I acknowledge may not be much, given that you have no reason to take my word for anything, you haven't stated an opinion in front of me yet that was wrong." Alma Briggs, in the corner, made a small sound that she covered with a cough. Pearl looked at James and James looked at Pearl, and neither of them said anything, but the thing that passed between them in that silence was large enough to fill the room. He rode out into the north wind that night, and Pearl sat by the fire for a long time after he was gone, her hands in her lap, feeling the specific and terrifying sensation of understanding that she had fallen in love with James McCrae, and that there was absolutely nothing she was going to be able to do about it. December moved forward with the particular urgency of a month that knows it's running out. The schoolchildren put on a Christmas pageant that Pearl had organized, and which involved Tommy Holt getting his sheep's ear caught in the scenery, which he handled with enormous dignity. The town decorated its storefronts with pine boughs and red ribbon. Alma baked gingerbread every Tuesday and left a plate of it outside Pearl's door. James came into town 3 times a week, which was more than a man whose ranch operated this efficiently needed to come into town, and everyone was aware of that, and nobody said so except Edna Prout, who said it cheerfully and directly to Pearl on the morning she brought her mail. "He came in Tuesday for nothing but coffee and conversation," Edna said, handing over a letter from Pearl's sister in Austin. "He could have had coffee at his own ranch." "Perhaps he prefers the company," Pearl said. "He prefers yours specifically," Edna said. "The rest of us are incidental." The letter from Pearl's sister was from her younger sister, Nora, who was 23 and cheerfully married to a schoolteacher in Austin, and had 3 young children who apparently kept the house in a state of perpetual, affectionate chaos. Nora wrote, "Tell me everything about this place you've landed in, and whether there is anyone worth looking at twice." Pearl wrote back and described the schoolchildren and the Cottonwood Grove, and the way the hills south of town looked at sunset. She did not mention James McCrae because she knew exactly what Nora would say about it, and she was not ready to say it herself. The week before Christmas, James asked her if she would like to see the broken spur. He asked her over coffee at Mrs. Calloway's table, in a voice that was entirely uncasual despite every effort he was making. "I'd like you to see it," he said. "It's important to me, and you're important to me. It seems right." The sentence arrived with the weight of something much larger than it technically said. Pearl looked at her coffee cup. She thought about everything she had told herself about being careful, about not letting anything move faster than she was prepared for it to move. She thought about the dark past, and the hidden motives and the traps she had laid out in her imagination in order to be ready for them. And then she thought about the fact that every single trap she had anticipated had failed to materialize, and that James McCrae had, for 2 months now, been consistently and quietly and unfailingly exactly who he appeared to be. "Yes," she said, "I would like to see it." He came to get her on a Saturday morning in a wagon, not on horseback, because he had thought about the fact that she probably didn't ride and had not assumed otherwise. That small, practical consideration, thinking about her comfort without being asked to, did more damage to her remaining defenses than 2 months of conversation had managed. The broken spur was 12 miles south of Harlow Creek, and the drive took them through the kind of Texas hill country that exists mostly in paintings, and the memories of people who have been lucky enough to see it: limestone bluffs and scrub oak and cedar, and the particular dry gold of winter grass against a blue sky that went on longer than you expected sky to go. The ranch itself was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something in proportion to the legend, something large and imposing, and arranged to communicate power. What she found instead was a compound of well-built but functional buildings, a bunkhouse and a barn and several outbuildings, all of them clearly maintained with care, but none of them ornate. The main house was solid and comfortable, built from limestone blocks, with a wide porch facing east to catch the morning light. James showed her around with the quiet pride of a man showing someone something he had made, and she understood as they walked that this was what he meant when he talked about his land. Not the acreage and not the cattle and not the business of it, but the place itself. The way the creek ran along the eastern boundary, and the way the hills folded around the south pasture, and the way the house sat in the landscape as though it had grown there. His foreman, an older Mexican man named Rodrigo Santos, greeted Pearl with formal courtesy and then said something quiet to James in Spanish, and James responded in equally fluent Spanish, and Pearl stored that piece of information alongside the others. "You speak Spanish," she said when Rodrigo had gone. "My mother's family was from south of the Rio Grande," James said. "She came north when she was 17. The ranch hands speak mostly Spanish, so it made sense to be useful." "Your mother," Pearl said. "What was she like?" He smiled, a full smile this time, not the careful corner of a smile she had seen before, and it was devastating. "She was the strongest person I ever knew," he said. "She outlived 2 hard winters and a cattle epidemic and a drought that lasted 3 years, and she did it without complaint. She died 8 years ago, and I still think about something she said at least once a week." What kind of things did she say? He thought about it. She used to say that the most important thing a person could do was see people clearly and let themselves be seen clearly. That most of the pain in the world comes from people seeing what they want to see instead of what's actually there. Pearl was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She sounds like she was right." "She usually was," he said. They had lunch on the porch with the winter sun warm on the limestone and the hills spread out before them, and Rodrigo's wife, Carmen, brought out soup and fresh bread and a quiet dignity that made Pearl feel, unexpectedly and powerfully, at home. She had not felt at home anywhere since Galveston, and even in Galveston it had been a conditional home, dependent on other people's approval, which had been withdrawn the moment it became inconvenient. This felt different. This felt like a home that stayed put. She did not say any of that to James. She ate her soup and looked at the hills and felt it quietly inside herself. And when he looked at her, she looked back at him, and he seemed to see something in her expression that made him draw a slow, careful breath. On the drive back to Harlow Creek in the late afternoon, with the sun going down behind the hills and the air sharp and clean and cold, James said, "Pearl." She turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road, on the 2 horses moving steadily through the winter dusk, and he said, "I'm not going to make a declaration today, because I think you'd be more comfortable if I didn't. But I want you to know that what I feel for you is not casual and it is not temporary, and whenever you are ready to hear the rest of it, I will say it plainly." Pearl looked at him for a long time. He had given her the most remarkable gift. He had told her everything she needed to know and then given her the time and the space to decide what to do with it. No pressure, no ultimatum, no hidden motive. "James," she said quietly. He looked at her then, just a glance, his hands steady on the reins. "I'm not quite ready yet," she said, "but I'm closer than I was." He nodded and looked back at the road, and she could see that it cost him something to simply accept that, and that he was accepting it anyway, and that was perhaps the most significant thing she had ever seen a man do. Christmas arrived with a small storm that blew through in the night and left Harlow Creek under 2 inches of snow on Christmas morning, which was unusual enough for Central Texas that everyone came outside to stand in it and look at it as though it were a gift. Pearl stood on Alma Briggs's porch in her coat with her coffee and looked at the white street and thought about the fact that this was the first Christmas in 3 years that she had not woken up with the specific weight of grief for a life that had been taken from her, and that the absence of that weight felt enormous. James brought her a gift on Christmas afternoon, a book she had mentioned once, in passing, that she had been looking for. She had not expected him to remember. She had not expected him to remember the title or the author's name, which she had given him for approximately 30 seconds in a conversation 2 months ago. He handed it to her on Alma's porch with the same careful uncasualness that she had come to recognize as his way of doing things that mattered, and she took it and held it for a moment and then looked up at him and said, "You remembered." "I remember everything you tell me," he said simply. She kissed him. It was not planned. It was not the product of any decision she consciously made. She simply stepped forward and put her hand against his jaw and kissed him, and for one moment he was completely still with surprise, and then he kissed her back with a gentleness that was not timidity but something much more intentional. A very deliberate tenderness that told her he understood what this was, understood what it had cost her, and was not going to do anything but hold it carefully. When she stepped back, his eyes were open and looking at her with that expression she had been learning to read, which now contained, clearly and unambiguously, love. "There it is," he said softly. "There it is," she agreed. Alma Briggs appeared in the doorway behind them, took one look at the two of them, and said, "Finally," with the complete conviction of a woman who had seen this coming from the very first Sunday supper, then went back inside. The new year came in with clear skies and the particular quality of January light in Texas that makes everything look clean and possible. Pearl went back to her students after the holiday and taught them geometry and poetry and the history of the Republic of Texas, and James came into town every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday, and gradually the rhythm of those visits became as natural as breathing. In February, he asked her formally. He did not make a spectacle of it. He came to the schoolhouse after her students had gone home and he knocked on the door, and when she opened it, he was standing on the step with his hat in his hands again, the way he had been the very first time, and she thought with a complicated warmth about how far they had both come since that afternoon. He said, "Pearl, I would like you to marry me and live at the Broken Spur and teach school in Harlow Creek for as long as you want to teach, or not teach if you change your mind, and I would like to spend the rest of my life being someone you are glad you trusted." She looked at him for a long time. "The last sentence," she said, "that's the important one." "I know," he said. She thought about everything. She thought about Galveston and Edward Harmon and the courtroom and the cold walk out of that city. She thought about the asters on the schoolhouse step and the honey and the candle. She thought about the drive to the Broken Spur and the soup on the porch and the hills folding around the south pasture and the way Carmen Santos's kitchen had smelled like wood smoke and cumin. She thought about Christmas afternoon and the book and the kiss and the way he had said, "There it is," with every wall he had ever built around his own heart simply gone. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, James McCrae." He exhaled the same slow, careful exhale she had heard the first time she invited him to sit on the bench outside her schoolhouse. And then he smiled, the full smile, the devastating one, and stepped up onto the step and took her hands in his and held them with a warmth that felt like the best answer anyone had ever given to the question of whether she was safe. They were married in April in the white clapboard church on Main Street, with the whole of Harlow Creek in attendance because nobody in a town of 400 people misses a wedding, particularly not one that the town has been collectively anticipating since October. Edna Prout cried, which she denied afterward. Alma Briggs wore her best green dress and sat in the front row, and nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had known from the beginning exactly how this was going to go. Pearl wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored muslin and lace she had ordered from a merchant in San Antonio, and she walked down the aisle of that church without anyone to give her away. Her father was 10 years gone, and she had no male relative close enough to make the journey, and that was all right, because she had given herself to herself a long time ago, and what she was doing now was choosing, freely and with full knowledge of what choice meant. To share her life with someone she had decided to trust with it. James stood at the altar in a dark coat that Alma Briggs had strongly recommended, and he got right and watched Pearl walk down the aisle with an expression that every person who saw it would describe afterward as the face of a man who could not believe his luck, and who understood completely that luck was not the right word for what he had, but was feeling too much to find the right one. The minister, Reverend Colby, performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man who had married a great many frontier couples, and understood that the words mattered, but the meaning was in the faces of the people saying them, not in the length of time it took to say them. When he said, "You may kiss the bride," James cupped Pearl's face in both hands with a care that made several women in the congregation reach for their handkerchiefs, and kissed her in a way that was completely appropriate for a church, and also conveyed everything that was not said, but had been understood between them for months. The reception was in Alma's yard, which was the largest private yard in Harlow Creek, and which Alma had spent 3 days decorating with paper lanterns and ribbon and flowers she had somehow coaxed out of the cold spring earth. Rodrigo Santos and Carmen came up from the ranch with a wagon full of food that Carmen had spent 2 days preparing, and the whole thing was warm and loud, and full of people who were genuinely happy for the two of them. Pearl stood at the edge of it all for a moment in the early evening, watching James talk to old Horace Denny, who was telling him something that involved a great deal of arm movement, and she felt the precise sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not where she had been told to be, not where someone else's plan had put her, where she had chosen through everything to arrive. She moved into the Broken Spur at the end of April, and the first month was an act of mutual discovery that was sometimes simple and sometimes complicated and always interesting. She learned the rhythms of a working ranch, the way the days started before sunrise with purposes she had never had to think about before, the way the seasons structured everything, the way Rodrigo Santos and the other vaqueros moved through the day with an efficiency that was almost musical. She learned that James woke early and moved quietly and made terrible coffee, and she established early and firmly that coffee-making was her domain. James learned the rhythms of a woman who had spent 3 years relying entirely on herself, the independence that was not stubbornness but genuine competence, the way she needed quiet in the mornings before she was ready to talk, the way she worked through problems silently, and then arrived at conclusions that were almost always correct. He learned not to crowd her thinking. He learned to read the difference between the quiet that meant she was processing something and the quiet that meant she was content. Carmen Santos became something close to a friend, which was its own complicated and valuable thing. Carmen had opinions about household management that were extensive and occasionally forceful, and Pearl had opinions about her own household that were equally extensive, and they arrived at a working partnership that involved a great deal of mutual respect and some very direct conversations. Pearl continued teaching school in Harlow Creek, driving the 12 miles in the wagon 3 days a week. James had quietly arranged that Rodrigo's nephew, A 16-year-old named Lewis who was learning the ranch work, would drive her in and back, which freed James from the concern of her traveling alone on the road. Pearl accepted this arrangement after establishing clearly that it was about her safety on a remote road, and not about her ability to handle a wagon, which she was in fact perfectly capable of doing. "I know you can handle the wagon," James said. "Good," Pearl said. "Lewis is a better shot than you," James said. Pearl considered this. "That is a fair point," she said. In the summer she discovered she was pregnant, and the discovery hit her with a mixture of joy and terror that she sat with for 3 days before she told James, because she needed to process it herself first. She told him on a Tuesday evening on the porch, with the summer dark coming in and the fireflies going in the pasture, and he sat very still for a moment and then said, "Pearl." "Yes," she said. "Come here," he said. She sat beside him and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the fireflies in the pasture for a long time without saying anything else, because everything that needed to be said was already understood. The pregnancy was straightforward and sturdy, the way Pearl herself was, and Dr. Hendricks, who served Harlow Creek and the surrounding ranches, declared her in excellent health at every visit. She taught school until October and then handed the classroom to a substitute, a young man from Waco named Barnes who was perfectly competent, and to whom she gave 3 pages of very detailed notes about each student. In November, on a cold, bright morning, she gave birth to a son. James held him in the first hour with the expression of a man who has had something placed in his hands that he understands he must be worthy of, and looked at Pearl across the bedroom with something so large in his eyes that she felt it from across the room. They named him Thomas Samuel McCrae, for James's father and Pearl's father, and he was an excellent baby who communicated his needs clearly, and was regarded by everyone at the Broken Spur with the seriousness that he seemed to expect. Alma Briggs came out to see him on the 4th day and held him with the practiced authority of a woman who had held a great many babies, and said to Pearl, "He looks like his father, but he has your eyes." "I know," Pearl said. She was sitting up in bed and feeling, beneath the particular exhaustion of new motherhood, a deep and settled happiness that she was still learning the geography of. "Are you all right?" Alma asked, looking at her carefully. "Yes," Pearl said, and then, because Alma deserved the complete truth, "I'm better than I have been in years. I'm better than I knew how to be." Alma nodded with the simple satisfaction of a person who has always known something would turn out well and is glad to be right. Tom, as he was called almost immediately, grew quickly and loudly, and with enormous curiosity about everything on the ranch. By the time he was walking, Rodrigo Santos had taken a devoted interest in his education about horses, introducing him to the gentlest animals in the stable with a care and patience that Pearl found deeply moving. James carried him on the black horse, which was named Captain, from the time Tom was 2, and the boy showed no fear whatsoever, which both pleased and slightly alarmed his parents. The seasons moved the way seasons do on working land, with a purposefulness that organizes life around them, whether you intend it or not. The Broken Spur expanded in those years, not through any aggressive acquisition, but through careful management and the building of relationships with neighboring ranchers that operated on mutual respect. James had a way of doing business that was founded on his mother's principle, seeing people clearly and letting himself be seen, and it made him not the richest man in the county but the most trusted one, which turned out to matter more. Pearl, for her part, went back to teaching when Tom was 18 months old, this time 4 days a week, because she had discovered that the schoolhouse was a thing she needed the way she needed air and water. It was where she did the work that was specifically hers, that did not overlap with anything else in her life, and the particular satisfaction of watching a child understand something they had not understood before was something she had no intention of giving up. The town of Harlow Creek grew in those years. A second general store opened. The school expanded to 2 rooms, which meant Pearl had a colleague, a young woman named Helen Marsh from Philadelphia, who arrived in 1885, with a degree from a normal school and strong opinions about pedagogical theory that Pearl engaged with seriously and sometimes argued with vigorously, which was the beginning of a friendship that lasted decades. Edna Prout married the new telegraph operator, a quiet man named Silas who was clearly terrified of her and deeply in love with her, which Pearl found endlessly charming. Alma Briggs continued to run the boarding house with the iron efficiency of someone who had been managing human beings since before most of them were born, and she spent Sunday evenings at the Broken Spur with a frequency that made her essentially family. In 1886, Pearl and James's second child arrived, a daughter, born in May when the bluebonnets were still out on the hillsides. They named her Margaret Ann, for James's mother and Pearl's grandmother, and she was small and dark-haired and had James's gray-green eyes, and from her first weeks of life, she demonstrated a personality that suggested she was going to be a great deal of work in the most rewarding possible sense. Tom, who was 4, received his sister with the solemn gravity of someone who has been given a large responsibility and intends to take it seriously. He held her with Rodrigo's supervision and said, "She is very small," in a tone that implied he expected her to grow out of this and become useful. "She will get bigger," James assured him. "Good," Tom said, and handed her carefully back to Pearl. The summer of 1887 brought a drought that tested every rancher in the county, and the Broken Spur weathered it better than most because James had spent years building water retention infrastructure that most people had considered excessive when he built it. When the smaller ranches around them were struggling, James shared access to the Broken Spur's water in exchange for help with cattle management, which kept several families from losing their operations. The county would not forget that, and nor would the families involved, and neither James nor Pearl wanted them to remember it as a debt. It was simply what you did when you had enough and your neighbors did not. There were harder things in those years, too. The injustices of the frontier were real and persistent. The way land was taken, the way certain people were rendered invisible by law and by practice. Rodrigo Santos's brother-in-law lost his family's land grant through a legal process that was technically lawful and morally unconscionable, and James spent 3 months working with a lawyer in Austin trying to reverse it. And they did not succeed, and that failure sat in him with a weight that Pearl understood because she had known her own version of it. He put what money he could toward the family's resettlement and kept them employed on the Broken Spur and never spoke of it as generosity, only as the least inadequate thing he could do. The railroad came through in 1888 with a spur line to Harlow Creek that changed the economics of the whole county overnight. Suddenly the market for beef was larger and faster, and the cattle could be shipped rather than driven, and the Broken Spur's operation scaled accordingly. James navigated that expansion with the same careful attention to his people that he had always had. The vaqueros' wages went up when the revenue went up, which was not universal practice, and which Rodrigo noted with quiet, eloquent gratitude. Pearl watched all of this and added it to what she knew of James McCrae, which by 1888 was an extensive and richly detailed knowledge. She knew him in every ordinary configuration of a life, tired at the end of a long day, cheerful on Sunday mornings, frustrated by equipment failures, tender with the children and the horses and the few people he let fully inside his guard. She knew the things that made him laugh, which included Tom's running commentary on the world, the specific absurdity of cattle who refused to behave logically, and Edna Prout's complete inability to end a conversation in under 20 minutes. She knew what worried him at night, lying beside her in the dark, whether the water would hold through another dry summer, whether he was managing the business fairly by everyone who depended on it, whether he was the father his children needed him to be. She told him when he voiced that last worry that he was. "How do you know?" he asked, not doubting her, just wanting to understand. "Because Tom follows you around this ranch like you are the most important geography he has ever encountered," Pearl said, And Margaret talks to her dolls in your voice, which she has apparently identified as the voice of someone who knows what they are doing. He was quiet for a moment. She talks to her dolls in my voice. She does, it's very commanding. The dolls seem to respect it. He laughed, a full, uncomplicated laugh that she had spent years learning to love, and pulled her closer in the dark. And outside the window the Texas sky was enormous and star-bright, and Pearl lay with her head against his chest, and listened to his heartbeat and thought about the October afternoon 6 weeks after she had arrived in Harlow Creek, when Edna Pruitt had told her the truth about James McCrae in the middle of Calloway's general store. Nobody had told her. Not Alma, not Clarence Holt, not the families whose children she taught. For 6 weeks, while she had been believing herself invisible and safe in her anonymity, James McCrae had been asking about her with a persistence that she had initially found alarming, and had come to understand was the most coherent way he knew to express something he did not yet have the right to say. He had been asking because she mattered to him from the moment he saw her, and he did not know how to explain that to anyone, including himself, and so he had done the only thing he could do. He had tried to know her from a distance, carefully, without intrusion, until he had the courage to stand in her doorway with his hat in his hands. She had been so afraid of being known. She had come to Texas to be invisible, and instead she had been seen, not used, not assessed for utility, not cataloged for advantage, but seen, by a man who had looked at her stepping off a stage on an October afternoon and felt responsible for her and had spent 6 weeks trying to understand why. "James," she said. He said, most of the way to sleep. "I'm glad Edna told me." "Told you what?" he asked without opening his eyes. "That you had been asking about me," Pearl said. "I was angry at first, but I'm glad." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad she told you too. I wasn't going to be able to keep not talking to you for much longer. I was running out of reasons to be in town. You came in for fence wire." "I have enough fence wire to last until 1910, he said. Pearl laughed quietly in the dark, and he tightened his arm around her, and the ranch settled around them in the night sounds of a working property, wind through the cedar, the distant sound of cattle in the south pasture, the creak of the porch boards in the cooling air. In 1890, Nora came to visit from Austin. Pearl's sister arrived with her husband, Robert, and their 3 children, all under the age of 8, and the Broken Spur absorbed the chaos of that visit with a grace that suggested it had been built for exactly this kind of expansion. Tom and Nora's eldest, a boy named Samuel, formed an immediate and vigorous friendship based entirely on a shared interest in every animal on the property. Margaret attached herself to Nora with an intensity that was clearly based on the recognition that here was a woman who talked at the same speed Margaret did, which was faster than most. Nora pulled Pearl aside on the second evening and said, directly, "He is not at all what I worried you might end up with." "What did you think I might end up with?" "Someone appropriate," Nora said, with clear disdain for appropriateness. "Someone who looks good and is careful and never makes you feel anything difficult." "But he actually looks at you, Pearl. He notices when you change subjects because you are not ready to talk about something, and he lets you change it, and he remembers to come back to it later when you are." She looked at her sister steadily. "That took me 4 years to teach Robert, and he is a very good man." Pearl smiled at her sister. "He is not easy," she said. "He has his silences and his stubbornness and his complete conviction that he knows exactly how fences should be built, which is an opinion he holds with more certainty than seems warranted." "But," Nora said. "But I trust him," Pearl said, "completely, and I did not think I was going to be able to say that about anyone again." Nora took her hand and held it for a moment without speaking, which was as much as either of them had ever needed. The years that followed were the years of a life that was full, not uncomplicated, not without its seasons of difficulty and loss, but full in the way that only a life built on good foundations can be. The Broken Spur grew into one of the most respected ranches in the Texas Hill Country, not through aggression or acquisition, but through careful, principled management, and the kind of reputation that accumulates when you consistently do what you say you will do. Tom grew into a young man who had his father's steadiness and his mother's capacity for sustained thought, and who at 17 declared his intention to study law, which was partly inspired by what he knew of his parents' histories, and partly by his own clear-eyed observation of the ways in which the legal system could be both a weapon and a shield. Pearl watched her son make this declaration, and felt a pride so large it was almost physical. Margaret, at 15, was already running rings around everyone in the schoolhouse, and had developed an interest in medicine that Pearl took seriously, and James took seriously, and that doctor. Hendricks, who had watched her grow up and had occasionally allowed her to observe his work, took very seriously indeed. In 1890, there were almost no female physicians in Texas. By the time Margaret was old enough to pursue it, the world would be, Pearl believed, at least partially more ready for her. One evening, in the spring of 1891, Pearl and James sat on the porch of the Broken Spur in the twilight, and the hills to the south were purple, and the sky above them was the deep, clear blue of a late spring evening, and Tom and Margaret were somewhere inside the house in the middle of an argument about something that involved a great deal of enthusiastic emphasis, and Carmen Santos had gone home to the bunkhouse compound, and Rodrigo was making his last rounds of the stock. And the porch was theirs. James reached over and took Pearl's hand, and she turned her hand over to hold his, and they sat like that for a while in the comfortable silence that was one of the things she treasured most about the life they had made. "I've been thinking," James said. "About what?" "About the fence on the East Ridge," he said, and about us. "Start with us," Pearl said. "The fence can wait." He looked at her in the fading light. He was 42 now, and the years of outdoor work had etched themselves into his face in the way they did for men who spent their lives in sun and wind, and he was more striking for it in a way that she was not entirely objective about. "I was thinking about that October afternoon," he said, "when the stage came in." "I was thinking about that too earlier," she said. "I think about it sometimes," he said, "and I try to identify the version of that day in which I didn't go over to Clarence Holt and ask your name, and I can't find it. I can't find the version of that afternoon where I was sensible about it and let it go." "If you had been sensible," Pearl said, "Edna would never have had anything to tell me." "If I had been sensible," James said, "I would have driven home and convinced myself it was none of my business and gotten on with my life, and you would have taught school in Harlow Creek and been very good at it and eventually gone somewhere else, and I would have spent the rest of my life ranching and being fine." "Fine," Pearl said. "Fine," he agreed. "Which is a terrible thing to be when you could be this." She looked at the hills going dark in the south, and the first stars beginning to appear, and felt the particular completeness of a moment that contains everything it needs to contain. "I was so afraid," she said, "when Edna told me. I was so certain it was something I needed to be defended against." "I know," he said. "You were magnificent about it. You were terrifying, actually." "You didn't seem terrified." "I was," he said. "I was terrified every single time I came to find you. I was terrified you would decide I was exactly what you'd left Galveston to get away from." He paused. "I was terrified I would not be enough of what you deserved." Pearl turned to look at him directly. "James McCrae," she said, "you have been, every day since the bench outside the schoolhouse, exactly enough of what I deserve and considerably more." The look on his face at that, the quiet, undone expression of a man who has been given something he was not entirely certain he had earned, was the face she would see in her memory for the rest of her life as the face of the person who loved her. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, not without the particular complications that came from two people who had both been shaped by loss, and had both had to decide, at some point, whether to let the loss make them or whether to insist on making themselves. They had both chosen to make themselves, and then they had chosen each other, and on the porch of the Broken Spur in the spring twilight of 1891, that seemed like exactly the right sequence of events. Tom emerged from the house a few minutes later and said, "Papa, Margaret is being absolutely unreasonable about the mathematics problem." And Margaret appeared 2 seconds behind him and said, "I am being precisely reasonable. It is Thomas who does not understand the problem." And James looked at Pearl, and Pearl looked at James, and they both looked at their children. And the evening moved forward into the full dark with the sound of voices and the smell of cedar and the particular, irreplaceable warmth of a life that has found its shape. In the autumn of 1892, Pearl found herself expecting again, which they had not planned, and which arrived as a gift of the specific kind that comes without warning and rearranges everything delightfully. Tom, now 18 and preparing to leave for Austin to begin his legal studies, received this news with the expression of someone doing arithmetic and arriving at an interesting conclusion about the age gap. Margaret, who was 16 and inclined toward clinical observation, asked Pearl several medical questions that Pearl answered honestly, because she had never seen any value in pretending to Margaret that the world was simpler than it was. The third child, a son, arrived in March of 1893, and they named him William Rodrigo McCrae, William for James's grandfather and Rodrigo for the man who had been a second family to them both for 11 years. Rodrigo Santos, presented with this information, did not say anything for a full minute, and then he excused himself and went out to check on the horses, and Carmen, who had observed this from the kitchen doorway, smiled at Pearl with an expression that needed no translation. Tom was in Austin by then, beginning his first year of reading law. He wrote long, detailed letters that were full of the particular excitement of someone encountering ideas that organized something he already knew. Pearl wrote back with equal length and detail, because she had always talked to her children as people rather than as children, and Tom had been the beneficiary, and sometimes the victim of this approach. Margaret continued to grow into herself with the velocity of someone who has a great deal of territory to cover and a limited patience for moving slowly. By the time she was 18, she had corresponded with 2 female physicians, one in New York and one in Philadelphia, about the possibilities for medical education, and James and Pearl had both made clear, without qualification, that whatever path she chose would be supported. This was not a simple thing to offer in 1895, and both of them knew it, and Margaret knew they knew it, which was its own kind of gift. William, known almost immediately as Will, grew up as the youngest sibling of 2 people who were already formed enough to be genuinely interested in him, and this gave him a particular quality of being attended to that expressed itself as a settled confidence in his own small existence. He followed Tom's letters around the house like they were events, and listened to Margaret explain medicine with the solemn concentration of someone filing information for later use. He was an easy child, which Pearl accepted gratefully as the universe's acknowledgement that she and James had been handling a great deal for a great many years. Rodrigo Santos retired from active foreman duties in 1897 and was replaced by his nephew Louis, who had been learning the ranch for 15 years and who stepped into the role with a competence that made the transition smooth. Rodrigo and Carmen stayed in their house on the compound, and Rodrigo's official role became what it had always actually been: the person who knew everything about the land and the animals and the deep history of the place, and who shared that knowledge with anyone who asked. The century turned in the way centuries do, not dramatically, not with the fanfare of legend, but quietly, in the middle of ordinary life. Pearl was 46 years old in 1900, and stood in the kitchen of the Broken Spur on the first morning of January watching James make his terrible coffee, which she had been correcting for 17 years, and which had not improved appreciably. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stage in October of 1882 with one trunk and a recommendation letter, and a heart that was braced for impact. That woman would not have been able to imagine this kitchen, would not have been able to imagine the sound of Will's voice somewhere in the house, asking the dog a question that the dog was not answering, but was listening to with apparent attention. Would not have been able to imagine the letter on the table from Tom, who was now a practicing attorney in Austin with a wife named Clara. Not the Clara, a different Clara, a history teacher, and a daughter of his own, named Pearl for reasons that had made the original Pearl cry in a way she did not often permit herself. Tom's Clara was a woman Pearl had approved of immediately, and for reasons she considered sound. She was direct. She was intelligent. She had the specific quality of being genuinely interested in things, and she looked at Tom the way Pearl had eventually learned to let herself look at James, which was to say without the protective glass of performed indifference in front of it. Margaret was, in 1900, in her first year of medical practice in San Antonio, having completed training in Philadelphia, and returned to Texas with a determination to practice in a place that needed her. This had not been easy. The path had been full of the particular obstacles that met women who insisted on doing work that the world had not yet decided they were allowed to do. She had met every obstacle with a methodical persistence that Pearl recognized as the family trait it was, and she had prevailed. And she was in San Antonio doing the work she had decided at 15 she was going to do. James stood at the kitchen window on that first morning of the new century with his bad coffee in his hand and looked out at the hills and said, "What are you thinking about?" "The stage," Pearl said. He turned to look at her. "The stage that brought me here," she said, "that October afternoon." He came away from the window and set his coffee down and stood in front of her and took both her hands in his the way he had on the church step on their wedding day, with the same careful warmth that told her she was held, fully and securely, by something that had no intention of letting go. "Pearl Lockhart," he said, which was her maiden name, the name she had been when she stepped off the stage, the name she still thought of as her own self's name even though she was also Pearl McCrae. "James McCrae," she said back. "I would do it all again," he said. "Every question I asked, every fence-wire excuse." She looked at him and felt the 17 years between that October afternoon and this January morning like a country she had walked through and come to know completely. Its difficult terrain, and its beautiful seasons, and its hidden water, and its hills that caught the light in ways that made you stop and simply look. "So would I," she said. "Every bit of it." He kissed her in the kitchen on the first morning of 1900, and Will came in from somewhere with the dog at his heels, and made a sound of elaborate disgust at finding his parents kissing again, which was a thing he found both embarrassing and, Pearl suspected, deeply reassuring. And James ruffled his son's hair with the free hand that wasn't holding Pearl's, and the kitchen was full of January light, and the smell of bad coffee, and the sound of the broken spur waking up around them. Later that spring, when the bluebonnets were out on the hillsides and the cattle were moving to the higher pastures, and Will was finally old enough to ride Captain's replacement, a gray named Silver who had the same unruffled temperament as his predecessor, Pearl went down to the South Bridge alone one morning and stood on the planks and looked at the raker running clear and cold below her, and thought about the first time she had walked this path with James. She had been terrified that morning. Terrified of wanting something and having it be taken. Terrified of being seen and having what was seen be used against her. She had walked beside him with the careful posture of someone who is ready to run, and he had walked beside her with the careful pace of someone who would not chase her if she did, and somewhere between the bridge and the cottonwood grove, the terror had begun, very slowly, to ease. She had not run. She stood on the South Bridge in the spring of 1900 and was profoundly grateful that she had not run. She heard a horse behind her and turned, and James was coming along the path at an easy walk on Silver, who had apparently been borrowed from Will, and she watched him come toward her with the same awareness she had had on that first Saturday morning. The way he moved, the way he sat the horse with easy authority, the way he did not push forward but waited until he was close enough to talk without raising his voice. He stopped at the edge of the bridge and looked at her. "Alma is coming for supper," he said. "I know," Pearl said. "I invited her. She's bringing the Pruits," he said, "Edna and Silas." "I know that too," Pearl said. "Just thought you should be prepared," he said. "Edna Prout will talk from the moment she arrives until the moment she leaves," Pearl said. "I have been prepared for that for 18 years. She told me about you, you know. She is the reason any of this happened. I owe her an enormous debt." "She would tell you that herself if you gave her 30 seconds, James said. Pearl laughed, and the sound of it went out across the Raker and the Cottonwood Grove and the limestone hills beyond. And James McCrae looked at his wife laughing on the South Bridge in the spring morning, and let himself feel the complete and uncomplicated fact of everything they had made together. He climbed down from Silver and stood on the bridge beside her, and they looked at the water below them, and it was clear and running and catching the morning light the way it always did, the way it had been doing since long before either of them arrived in this part of Texas, and the way it would continue to do long after. "Nobody told me," Pearl said. He looked at her. "That you had been asking about me," she said. "From the very beginning. Nobody told me, and I had to find out from Edna in the middle of the general store, and I was furious for about an hour." "I know," he said. "You had a very controlled way of being furious." "I thought you were dangerous," she said. "I thought it was a trap." "I know," he said. "And you weren't," she said. "You were just you." He looked at the water for a moment. "I was trying to be," he said. She put her hand through his arm and leaned against him slightly, and they stood on the South Bridge over the Raker on a spring morning in 1900 and were, in the fullest and most complete sense of the word, home. Everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be done had been done, and everything that had needed healing had healed, not without its scars, but with the particular integrity of things that have genuinely mended rather than merely been covered over. Pearl Lockhart, who had arrived in Harlow Creek with one trunk and a recommendation letter, and a heart that was braced for impact, had found, against all the reasonable predictions of her experience, that the world sometimes contained what it seemed to contain, and that the most dangerous thing about James McCrae had turned out to be that he was exactly who he appeared to be. She had let herself be seen clearly in the end, and she had seen him clearly in return. And the life they had built on that mutual clarity was the most real and the most durable, and the most hers of anything she had ever made. The river ran below the bridge, and the bluebonnets were out on the hillsides, and somewhere south of them the broken spur was waking up around the sound of Will's voice, and the dog's enthusiastic response, and Carmen Santos's kitchen doing what it always did, and Harlow Creek was going about its Tuesday morning, and Edna Prout was already preparing what she would say at supper, and Tom and his Clara were in Austin living their own version of a life built on good foundations. And Margaret was in San Antonio doing the work she had chosen, and all of it was real and present and held. Pearl McCrae stood on the bridge in the spring morning and was, without reservation, without the glass of protective indifference in front of it, without the braced posture of someone ready to run, completely and irrevocably glad.